Hey Cornerstone family, hope you're doing well. I'm very excited about our worship service this weekend on Saturday, June 13th at 7 o'clock. And I'm excited for a couple of reasons. For one thing, we're going to be doing something a little bit differently this weekend. We're going to be addressing a topic that is sensitive, but one that I think is very timely and very important right now. And that's the subject of race. If you've been watching the news, you know that racial tensions are running very high in our country right now. In the aftermath of the killings of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, there has been a great public outcry for justice that has spawned everything from peaceful protests to all-out violent riots in the streets. We've seen these things in the news. And race is a big part of our national conversation right now. And I think that we as God's people need to be part of that conversation. And gratefully for us, the Bible is not silent on the subject of race. It has a lot to say about that subject. And so this Saturday evening, it will be our privilege to look at what the Bible has to say about the subject of race, and more importantly, what the Bible has to say about how we as God's people, as Christ followers, can be part of this conversation and conduct ourselves in a way that rather than deepening the current cultural and racial divides, we can actually have a hand in being part of the solution and being the healing touch of Jesus during these troubled times. And so I think it's an important conversation. I won't be preaching a formal sermon. Rather, our student pastor Leo Almeida and I will be having sort of a conversation about these things together. And so we'll appreciate your prayers as we prepare for that. And we'll also appreciate your presence. We'd love for you to be there. And that's the first reason I'm excited about our weekend worship service on Saturday. The second reason I'm excited about gathering this weekend is because we will be taking yet another baby step in the direction of a more normal situation. For the first time in several weeks, we will be gathering in our auditorium for worship, and I'm very excited about that. Over the past several weeks, it's been our privilege to gather for worship outdoors, and that's been fun. I've enjoyed that. I know that many of you have as well, but we do live in the state of Texas. It is the middle of June, and the mosquitoes and the heat and the rain are finally starting to catch up with us. And we decided, it's probably time we move indoors. And so that's a good thing. It's a step in the direction of normalcy, but I think we need to recognize things aren't yet back to normal, right? We are still facing a coronavirus pandemic that is still very contagious. It is still spreading. In fact, I think cases are on the rise in Texas. And the last thing we want to do as a church is to be the source of spreading this virus. That wouldn't be a very loving thing for us to do for each other or for our community. And so I think it is important, especially as we move from the outdoors to the indoors, that we take some additional safety precautions. I'm well aware of the fact that people have a variety of opinions about the coronavirus, the extent of its danger, what our response should be to this thing. Many people on one hand think that this whole thing is way overblown. On the other hand, there are people that are taking it very seriously. And even in the medical community, you'll find a divergence of opinions about what the coronavirus is and what proper safety protocols should be in this regard. And in the midst of all these conflicting opinions, how do we as a church make decisions, what standard we're going to live by? Well, gratefully, we as God's people have a standard. It's the Word of God. It's the Scriptures. But unfortunately, the Bible doesn't tell us whether we should wear a mask or not. It doesn't tell us how many feet we should stand apart from each other. It doesn't give those kinds of specific safety guidelines. But the Bible does provide some very helpful instructions, I think, for us that are very timely for us right now in Romans chapter 13. We've talked about this before. In that passage, the Apostle Paul reminds us that one very important way that God exercises his authority in our lives is by delegating a measure of that authority to government, the institution of government. Paul reminds us there that the institution of government is created by God for our good, and that we as God's people have an obligation to obey the laws of the land and to submit to the governments that God has placed over us. And while the Bible doesn't provide specific safety guidelines for churches that are reopening their doors for worship, gratefully our government, the state of Texas, has provided those guidelines, and we have been and will continue to be following those guidelines as we continue to reopen the doors for worship at Cornerstone. It's been my privilege as a pastor to be in conference calls with Governor Greg Abbott and Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick and other pastors. And I appreciate so much the fact that our government leaders have brought churches and pastors into this conversation as they've established policies. I'm grateful that unlike in other states, here in Texas, we have leaders that really do value the priority of religious liberty. They recognize the right of churches to gather for worship even in times like this. But while I appreciate the fact that they recognize that right, I think we need to recognize that with those rights come certain responsibilities, especially with the coronavirus right now. The state of Texas has provided guidelines and requirements for churches like ours that are reopening their doors for worship. And those safety guidelines are there for our good, they're for our safety. And so we as a church are more than happy to comply to those guidelines, and we will be doing that this weekend and in the days ahead. And so for those of you that are considering your attendance this weekend, we just wanted to let you know kind of what you can expect, what the safety protocols are that we will be following. And the first thing I would say is this: if you are sick, if you have symptoms that are in keeping with COVID-19, or if you've had significant exposure to somebody who has the virus, we would say this is the time for you just to stay home and continue to worshiping online. Also, for those of you that find yourself in maybe one of those higher risk categories, maybe you're up in years or you've got underlying health issues, again, use your discretion. You're welcome to come, but we would maybe say, maybe you'd consider staying at home as well for the time being and continuing to worship online. We will continue to put our worship services online so that you can do that. For those that choose to come this weekend, we will be disinfecting our building, and we'll be doing everything we can to make it possible for people not to have to touch a lot of common surfaces. We will be propping open all of our doors. We won't be handing out Bibles or bulletins or offering plates. Those that want to give to our offering can either do so online or through the box at the back of the auditorium. We'll be trying to discourage people from touching a lot of common surfaces. And we'll also discourage people from touching each other, right? One of the guidelines that we do need to follow is the social distancing guideline of maintaining 6 feet between each other. And what that will look like in terms of our worship service, as you walk into the auditorium on Saturday evening, and again, this is per the state of Texas guidelines, you will find that we have removed every other row of chairs in our auditorium to provide some spacing there. And within those rows, we've also created groupings of chairs that are a little bit separated from each other. Those of you that are part of the same household will be welcome to sit together, but we will need to have some distance between households and between individuals and families in the auditorium. During our worship service, we will be having a brief time of congregational singing. We will be having a brief time in God's Word together. We will be worshiping inside the building. But for those that wish to enjoy some conversation together or enjoy some good fellowship, we will ask that they take that outside the building. And even outside the building, there will be an expectation that we continue to maintain those social distancing guidelines of 6 feet between each other. And we know that it's going to be very tempting, right, to give somebody a good hearty Texas hug and extend a good hearty Texas handshake. And we would simply encourage you to resist that temptation right now. Big smiles and hearty verbal greetings are the order of the day, but sort of resist that physical contact. And we understand old habits die hard, and so, if maybe you inadvertently get a little too close to each other or you inadvertently shake somebody's hand, right, nobody's going to get angry. Sirens aren't going to go off. The social distancing police aren't going to descend from helicopters and break you apart. We're not going to be actively policing this, but we would ask that you police yourselves and your children, and both out of deference for the law as well as just out of love for each other and a desire not to spread this virus. We would encourage you to just maintain that proper social distance. With respect to masks, again, per the state guidelines, we are not requiring masks, but we are strongly recommending masks. And many of us who maybe felt comfortable not wearing a mask outdoors, I might encourage us very strongly to consider wearing a mask now that we are moving indoors. When I speak on stage, I won't be wearing a mask. I want people to be able to hear me clearly, but I will be wearing a mask before and after the service, and I would strongly encourage you to consider doing that as well. For those of you that may not have a mask, we will be having masks available for your use. And so as you can see, we will be following the guidelines set forth by the state of Texas and the requirements that have been given to us there. There are certain things that are required. There are other things that grant us a measure of latitude to make some personal choices. And we as a church are going to trust that you have the maturity, right, to make wise choices with respect to the safety and well-being of yourself and your families. And we are also going to trust that you have the maturity not to stand in judgment of people who might make different decisions than you choose to make. Remember, a couple weeks ago, I preached from Romans chapter 14 on the importance of navigating our differences with grace. And I think now more than ever, those biblical principles are very important and very relevant. We really need to lean into them. And so I just want to thank you up to this point for your flexibility, for your unity. for just rolling with the punches. And I want to thank you moving forward, that together we might, as Ephesians 4:3 says, be diligent to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. I really think that's important. And as we do that, as we move forward together with humility and grace and flexibility, I'm confident that we can get through this thing together. We really can. And so I would simply say, whether in the coming days and weeks you choose to be one of those people who remains at home and continues worshiping with us online, or whether you choose to join us in person for worship this weekend, I just want to say you are each a valued member of the Cornerstone family. We need you. We respect whatever decision you choose to make, and we love you. We miss you. We look forward to seeing you whenever we possibly can. And so until then, stay safe, stay well, stay encouraged, and stay faithful.